Chapter 7. First job out of high school. At the end of my high school senior year in Atlanta in 1972, my folks drove down to attend my graduation and bring me back home to New Jersey. They had bought me a new 1972 VW van to drive down to Georgia and let me drive it back. My first long-distance road trip where I was the driver. Once back in New Jersey, I felt quite lost, missing my friends and the fun experiences I had in Georgia. I did land a job as a security guard for $150 an hour at the Garden State Arts Center, now the PNC Arts Center in Homedale, New Jersey, a beautiful facility that held about 10,000 people. The place was owned by the Garden State Parkway Authority, so it was politically governed and bureaucratically controlled from day one. I'd heard about some of the concerts that had taken place there before I arrived. Acts like The Doors and Janis Joplin had appeared, but after too much pot smoke and too many acid-soaked hippie concert-goers had OD'd and or passed out in the parking lots, the Garden State Parkway Authority put a moratorium on future rock acts at that venue. My dad took me to see the rock band Iron Butterfly with Chicago, then Chicago Transit Authority, opening when I was 15 in June of 1969. In no way do I remember anybody being out of line. Of course, being a 2-year teenager, I wouldn't have known what to look for then anyway. I'm sure that someone falling down or lying in the parking lot would have been a dead giveaway, but I simply don't recall anything like that. I just loved the music, knowing it was taking hold of me. I greatly appreciated my dad for taking me to that show. When I actually got hired for the security guard job there in 1972, I was stoked. It would allow me to go to the beach during the day, only to be at work by 6 p.m. in order to experience each show. The Garden State Arts Center was bringing in busloads of thousands of senior citizens to see a big band show by Bing Crosby's brother, Bob Crosby and the Bobcats. Bob would start the show with the classic Summertime, which turned out to be his signature song. Bing Crosby was a familiar name to me, but I had never heard of Bob. My folks quickly straightened me out on that score, telling me that they grew up listening to the Bobcats, and that I really was in the company of greatness. Another week brought the United States Military Band in for 2 daily matinee shows. These guys were sharp, with a full orchestra as well as a huge voice chorale. They were in their crisp military uniforms with shiny buttons and glistening shine shoes, and standing straight ahead at attention while on stage. Off stage, that was a different story. When the chorale guys would file off to the backstage area, they would start cutting up and holding their aching heads caused by their hangovers from the previous night's partying at our local Holiday Inn. They were hilarious. When, after talking to a few of them and they found out I played music, they all hovered around me like a protective family and brought the conductor over to introduce me. In telling him that I had been drum major during my senior year in high school and had played trumpet since the 5th grade, he asked me if I would like to be in a band like theirs. It really caught me off guard because I didn't know how to respond. Of course I would have loved to. I told him that it looked like it would be a great experience, but in the back of my mind, all I could think about was basic training and 3 or so months of having to get up at dawn and crawl through mud. The other issue is that the Vietnam War was still in full swing, although military de-escalation was in progress. My draft number was low, which really wasn't an issue at the time. Having just spent 5 years at a partial military school, my sights were set on taking on life on my own terms. There aren't many regrets in my life, but I often wonder what the other outcome might have been had I chosen that other path. The audition would have been on trumpet anyway, and my interest and confidence in myself on that instrument was definitely low, or for lack of a better word, terrible. I can still just picture blowing the audition and being sent to the front lines. Had there been any guitar players in the band that day, my decision may have been different. Years later, a good friend of mine and a great guitar player in a well-known southern rock band actually went into the Army with playing guitar assigned as his official duty during his whole enlistment. Timing is everything. During one of my first weekends working, Bob Hope was doing his USO-type performance at the GSAC. Duke Ellington was the opening act. I so much wanted to see Duke in action. At age 18, I was just beginning to understand the magnitude of talent guys like these had. Before that, acts like Bob Crosby and the Bobcats were just, quote, music my parents listened to, unquote. My boss, being the real jerk that he was, and knowing that I wanted to see the Duke, intentionally assigned me to a detail away from the theater, guarding Bob Hope. This is not what I had in mind. I knew my grandma would dig the opportunity, but I was not the least bit impressed. Another security guard, and I use that term loosely, and I were sent to spend the afternoon guarding the outside of the house where Bob Hope was resting before his show. It was located off the Garden State Parkway by way of an official private entrance and exit ramp. When it was time for Hope to leave for the theater, we did get to shake hands with him as he came out to get in the limousine. He was cordial, but I'm sure he could have cared less about meeting a couple of skinny teenagers in rent-a-cop uniforms. To me, Bob Hope was before my time and from my parents' generation, as was Duke Ellington. The difference was that Duke played music, and I really wanted to hear it. As soon as Hope was in his limousine, I was down the road following it to the venue in a flash. My VW van had never gone so fast. I entered the backstage parking area practically on 2 wheels and bolted into the rear entrance, still hoping to catch any part of Duke's show. When I got to the stage, the curtain was closed and the Duke was gone. He had literally just walked off stage where 10,000 people were on the other side of the curtain. His grand piano was still there with the top open, but it was still warm. I went straight to his piano and stuck my head into it, knowing I just missed one of my life's greatest opportunities. I thought that maybe, just maybe, by sticking my head into Duke Ellington's piano just after he played it, something, anything, might rub off. I still carry that memory of my head in that piano to this day. My coworkers thought I was nuts, which for all intents and purposes, I was. I didn't care. As I got older, my respect for Bob Hope and his talent, as well as celebrities like him, increased greatly by realizing just how many people they must have touched during their lifetimes. At my young age, it was virtually impossible to know their stories as well as understand the struggles they had to overcome to get to the top. I was also just beginning to understand how much class musicians like Duke Ellington had. I'm convinced that my boss assigned me to Bob Hope's afternoon nap location on purpose in order to miss Duke Ellington's set. He was a real asshat anyway, and this action confirmed it. Since the shows at the GSAC during my time there had been scaled down to lower-key vaudeville and middle-of-the-road music acts instead of the rock acts that I was interested in at that age, I had to make the best of the situation. Although just beginning to realize it at the time, this was going to be a great learning experience for me. The acts would usually come in for a week at a time, so I would really be getting some great lessons in show business. During one of the week-long vaudeville reviews, Ray Bolger, the original Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz, was on the show. He was a very nice man, cordial and very friendly. While we were sitting together talking during a rehearsal one afternoon, I asked him a question that I had wondered about as a kid for years. There was the scene in the movie where the Wicked Witch of the West turned to him with a torch and said, quote, "How about a little fire, Scarecrow?" unquote. Then she proceeded to light him on fire. My question to him was how that went down. He said that something went wrong and she accidentally got burned worse than he did in the scene. It was so surreal at age 18 getting to hear stories like that from the real folks. Another week, Andy Williams made a week-long appearance. He came across as a real jackass to me. I recall an excited woman making her way down to give him a bunch of flowers. He carried them behind the curtain and just proceeded to angrily throw them to the side. But when the curtain opened up, it was all smiles as he went into his standard opening number of Moon River. He always appeared fake to me anytime he ever showed up on TV from then on. This was especially true when he was featured that same year on a Christmas TV special wearing the typical tacky dad Christmas sweater with the family gathered around the Christmas tree to celebrate the joyous holiday season. It was definitely lacking in any kissing under the mistletoe, since it was reported that he and his wife weren't even speaking when the show was filmed. As it turned out, the fact that the late Robert F. Kennedy's widow, Ethel Kennedy, was with Andy Williams the night I was working probably had a big hand in the absence of any marital bliss. Williams was close friends with the Kennedys and was with Bobby the night he was assassinated in Los Angeles in 1968. Andy's wife later took him to court for having an affair with Ethel. So much for peace on earth in that family. As stated earlier, many shows at the GSAC in 1972 stemmed back from vaudeville. It was obvious since the older crowd was behaving and not throwing up on the lawn seating, nor were they eating acid and tripping in the parking lot. The Mills Brothers came through one night as well as artists like Liza Minnelli. A favorite memory of mine is that of Liza during her week there. She was so nice and down to earth that it was hard to imagine that she was a Broadway legend of such high caliber, in addition to being Judy Garland's daughter. She asked me very nicely if I wouldn't mind walking her dogs, which I politely agreed to do. Her sister, actress Lorna Luft, was going to be showing up soon, so I agreed to make sure she got backstage with no problem. Desi Arnaz Jr. was also accompanying her that evening. He sat in on drums with the band during her show and did an admirable job. Liza is good people, but she sure has been the butt of many jokes about her personal life as years passed. To me, she was very genuine and down to earth. A little bit of that goes a long way. Another week had the Carpenters booked in for their nightly performances. Since they had some great LA studio musicians with them, I showed up really early to check out the rehearsals. Karen Carpenter was playing drums, and her brother Richard was the band director and piano player. He seemed agitated as he tried to show the rhythm and horn section the arrangements to, of all things, Johnny Be Good. These guys had to be howling inside with laughter. That Chuck Berry song was so easy and familiar that I already knew the guitar parts. Every kid first learning to play rock and roll guitar learns a Chuck Berry lick. I could have gotten through it with no problem. Karen Carpenter seemed really nervous and out of sorts, not unlike a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. She would jump at the slightest sudden noise. Since I had been around her briefly, I later read up on her history. It spoke of her insecurity. She was so talented, but oh so young. It seems that being thrown into the limelight like a whirlwind had taken its toll on her. Sadly, she would die 9 years later of a severe eating disorder. The teen idol shows were the most challenging. Pulling double duty for 2 shows one Saturday with teen idol David Cassidy of the TV show The Partridge Family really made me earn my meager wages. I was not looking forward to this show with a bubblegum artist that I never had any use for, musically or otherwise. Finding myself in front of the stage trying to hold back 10,000 screaming bubblegum teeny boppers was something not to be taken lightly. Our job was to stand at the foot of each aisle with arms stretched out firmly grasping the seat armrest to block access to the front of the stage. This worked for a little while, but when it appeared that I was in jeopardy of being snapped like a rubber band, all bets were off. When Cassidy hit the stage, the consecutive pop of 10,000 cameras with flashbulbs created what seemed like a nuclear flash. If I was going to get trampled, it was going to take a lot more than $1.50 an hour, and much more for a boss that I despised. David Cassidy was a good-looking kid and actually showed great talent, much more than the TV show ever displayed. He had an incredible band with extraordinary LA session musicians, which is what made me look up and take notice. The kids in the audience were oozing with love for their idol and were bringing truckloads of gifts, everything from homemade cookies to stuffed animals and who knows what else. This guy had the world in the palm of his hand, I thought. A documentary many years later showed David in recovery from addiction to drugs and alcohol and flat broke. I found myself feeling sorry for him, maybe because I was 40 years older and now I understood. It is such a shame that so many successful and talented people aren't able to step off what I refer to as the runaway treadmill of show business. Life is just a constant hustle. Being able to step off that mad, striving for that next whatever it is, even for a short while to enjoy it and regroup, becomes virtually impossible for so many. This is especially true and extremely dangerous when an artist makes the mistake of believing his or her own hype. Another show that summer with the Osmond brothers found me having learned a good lesson from the Cassidy show. My job that night was standing at the front gate, away from the madness. Fire me if you want, pay or no pay, I wasn't going near that stage. While working this position, a sweet little tiny girl carrying a small gift-wrapped box ran up to me crying and telling me that she just had to get this present to Donnie Osmond. She hugged me and begged me to please make sure Donnie received it. It broke my heart. I took it backstage and placed it on top of the already massive mountain of gifts. So many of these shows I was working were with seasoned veterans. While they were mostly from my parents' generation, most of them were really nice down-to-earth folks. Salt of the earth, to be exact. Turning 19 that summer, I was really impressionable. A lasting image I have etched in my mind is from Steve Lawrence and Eddie Gourmet. They were legendary entertainers and practically household names in the 60s and 70s. They had a good act with a great bunch of musicians behind them. On the last night of their week-long stint at the Garden State Arts Center, dozens of vans and buses were pulling up and parking in the large outside area behind the theater. At that moment, a whole group of people started rolling out hundreds of special needs and mentally challenged folks in wheelchairs onto the large outside backstage area. When Steve and Eddie emerged, the excitement of this wheelchair-bound crowd was almost deafening. My jaw dropped as these 2 legendary performers made their way around to shake hands with every single person in every single wheelchair. I was amazed and impressed at the same time. It was obvious that they didn't have to do this, but they wanted to. When I spoke to them, they were so cordial and nice that it just didn't seem like I was speaking to 2 people that had the worldwide notoriety they did. Steve Lawrence had made a joke earlier in their show to the band on stage about having worked a club in my little resort hometown of Keansburg, New Jersey years before. I couldn't help but mentioning that to him. We both laughed about it. Although I hadn't had the thousands of miles under my belt that I do now, I remember seeing the ad at the time and knew the joint he was talking about. A couple of other acts that summer were Liberace and Dionne Warwick on 2 separate weeks. Since my grandma was a fan of Liberace, I made it a point to get her in free one night to see him. She enjoyed that show, and I felt good making it happen. As far as Dionne Warwick was concerned, she was the problem child of the whole summer. No one, including our security, was to be backstage during her show. There was only room back there for one huge ego. Any more than that, the place would have burst into flames. She was pregnant during her week-long stay, actually waiting until 10,000 people were seated in the theater before she decided she didn't feel well enough to go on. I suppose this is the first in-your-face diva-like experience and attitude that I would run into with many artists in the years to come. When I witness this kind of behavior now, it is so laughable at how unimportant it really is. By this time, since the heavier rock acts had been banned from the Garden State Arts Center, the hardest-hitting talent I experienced there was Arlo Guthrie. Since I was already a fan of his, this was one of my favorite moments of this job. I got to hang out with him after his show on his 25th birthday on July 10th, 1972. While giving him a lift to his vehicle after the show, we decided to take a ride around the theater grounds in my van to grab a quick smoke. Wink, wink. I was so interested in knowing how he got to his level as a musician that I simply asked him what I needed to do to get into music. He said, just do it anywhere and everywhere you can. He also told me he remembered when he had to practically pay to play in some situations. While he is the son of the legendary folk icon Woody Guthrie, he still has his own influences and his own style. When I met him, he was totally content to being who he was. He still is. I still have his autograph wishing me luck. That experience, along with all of the others that summer of 1972, really gave me some great insight into what I would be in for as I attempted to carve out a career as a musician. I may not have realized it then, but do I ever now as I look back.